9. Portrait of a Teacher. The night before last, just before dinner, while my father was looking through the evening newspaper, he suddenly let out a cry of surprise. Later, he explained, "I had thought that he had died at least 20 years ago, but can you believe that my first teacher, Mr. Crossett, is still living? He is 84 years old, and yesterday the Department of Education gave him a medal for having completed 60 years of teaching." 60 years, can you imagine it? He gave up teaching only 2 years ago. He lives in Delaval, which is only about an hour's ride from here. Henry, tomorrow is Saturday. Let's drive over there in the afternoon and say hello to him. During the evening, my father spoke of little else. The very name of Mr. Crossett seemed to call up 1,000 memories of his boyhood, of his friends, and of his mother, now dead. I can still remember the first day I entered school. I had been sick for some time, and I was homeschooled. Thus, I began in the 3rd grade, which was the grade he always taught. I had never been separated from my mother for a single day before, and both for her and for me, it was a new experience. But Mr. Crossett seemed to understand the situation very well. He smiled at us and patted me on the head, and immediately all my fears disappeared. He must have been at least 40 years old then. He was a man of broad shoulders and thick, wide hands. He had come from the country and had educated himself by hard work and study. I can still see him as he entered the classroom each day. He would put his cane in the corner and hang up his coat with exactly the same movements. Every day, he also came with the same interest and enthusiasm, as though it were his first day of teaching. The next afternoon, my father and I drove to Delaval to see Mr. Crossett. Everyone in the town knew him, so we had no trouble in finding his house. When he came to the door, my father recognized him at once, though, of course, he was now a very old man. "Mr. Crossett," said my father, "will you allow an old pupil to shake hands with you?" Mr. Crossett, said my father, "will you allow an old pupil to shake hands with you?" Mr. Crossett looked at us curiously. "An old pupil? I'm sorry, but your name?" My father told him his name, Albert Borden, the year in which he had studied, and the name of the school. The old man dropped his head and began to say to himself my father's name. Suddenly he looked up. "Albert Borden? Your father was an engineer, and you lived very near the school." "Exactly right," said my father, shaking the old man's hand. Later, my father and Mr. Crossett talked for about half an hour over things and people they remembered from school. The old man's hands shook constantly, and he explained to my father how this shaking had begun 2 years ago, and how, only because of this, he had been forced to give up his teaching. Otherwise, he would still be working, because his heart and his soul were still in the schoolroom with his various students. He went to a kind of closet, and after a moment brought out a package, marked and catalogued by name and date. Out of the package he drew a paper and gave it to my father.